I first wanted to ask about the circumstances that led up to your composing this piece. What were they? Where were you? Why did you choose to write for double bass, and what brought you to that point?
Yeah, so it was basically at the start of lockdown last year. It must have been about April last year. I got an email from Bang on a Can asking me to write a piece for their upcoming. They had converted to these online marathons, and they were doing one in June, and they asked me to write a piece for Greg August. So yeah, so that was kind of it was a very tight turnaround. I think I had about 3 weeks maybe to write the piece. But yeah, it was sort of right bang in the middle of that first wave of lockdown and pandemic and not knowing what on earth was going to happen in the world. So that was sort of, yeah, I think the probably must have been the first piece of music I wrote properly in that time.
What was life like for you at that moment?
I think it was
Was your personal life and your family and going through that transition to lockdown?
Yeah, I mean, just such a huge transition. I obviously do a lot of work as a composer, but also as a performer. I'm a harp player. So
Mm.
when the pandemic kind of struck, I'd been on tour in Germany, and then suddenly, like overnight, we got up the next day and we had an email from the promoter saying, "Okay, that's it. The tour's cancelled. Pack your bags. You're going to the airport." And flew home, and that was it. And so I think there was just like in that first wave, there was this huge amount of kind of fear, I guess, first of all, about how bad this was going to be. And we were just watching these graphs go up and up and up of death
Mm.
numbers and infection rates. And then, yeah, unknown. It was the first time in 15 years that I'd suddenly been home for an extended period of time. So that in itself took getting used to. Um, and yeah, I guess, I mean, I remember thinking back on it now, even 3 weeks of full lockdown felt so long. And who would have thought a year later we'd still pretty much be in a full lockdown? But yeah, so it was a very curious time. But the title of this piece came because I live in Glasgow in Scotland, and I'm on this corner where there's four churches that surround me. So normally at the weekends, like you just hear this kind of clamoring of bells the entire time. And of course, all the worship had to stop as well, and all these church bells were completely silent for months on end, and so that's where the title came from.
How do you make the transition from recognizing a silence and giving the piece that title to creating the noises you want to make through composing this piece?
Um, so I suppose there was a few things that were happening that time. One was that I knew I wanted to kind of replicate this bell sound, and in that those kind of plucked strings that you get in the bass, that was kind of really like that bell like toming that's going
Mm.
on. But I think the other things that were happening, one of the things that I became very aware of were just like the natural sounds. Or the traffic stopped in the city. Suddenly you heard all these nature sounds, and it was almost like there was this like reclaiming of nature back into the city. You would get something like foxes out in the street, and the parks were just full, and you could hear all this bird song that hadn't been there before. So I think it was this very interesting time of silence of the sounds that we were used to, but also like this kind of tuning in then to all these other sounds, and so I think all of that plays into the piece. In this sort of, it feels like a balance between these bell like sounds and then maybe some more natural sounds in this urban environment.
What in terms of approaching writing for bass? Had you had any experience? Did you call upon uh, any prior knowledge or experience, or have any questions when you were putting it together?
Definitely. So, I mean, I had written for bass before in ensembles and in orchestra settings, but never for solo bass. And yeah, it definitely felt like a challenge to get to grips with. Like it's just even like the fact that it's tuned in the fourths rather than the fifths of like all the other string instruments makes it just a different thing straight away. And then this like extreme register. So yeah, I definitely did quite a bit of listening, quite a bit of talking. I have a good friend called Will Yeager,
Mm-hmm.
who kind of gave me some, like, showed me some sort of great bass repertoire pieces. And then did a lot of workshopping with Greg himself, which was great. And then subsequently, since that first performance, Robert Black has performed the piece as well. And again, we kind of went through a bit of a workshop process and just tweaked some things from that first performance, and tried some different things. And yeah, it's I always think it's so nice to allow a piece to keep evolving even once it's been written. So yeah.
You do have an indication to, as you mentioned, to perform in a very reverberant space or to use electronic reverberation. When you were putting together a piece and everybody is in lockdown, I'm curious about that concept. I didn't have access to a reverberant space that I could be in safely, so I'm using electronics and computers to mimic that sound. What your choice was when you were thinking about how to create a reverberant environment when everybody was locked down in different places?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I mean, I wasn't sure from place to place at the time when I got the commission. I wasn't sure what the performance environment for Greg would be, and you know, even now it's so different from country to country and region to region what's allowed and what's not. So for instance, like we would be able to go into a church alone and film or record something like that, as long as there was nobody else there, that would be possible. But yeah, I mean, it was definitely, obviously, it knowing that that might not be an option did change things. But I suppose I maybe, with having that reverb, I wanted to, even within a very locked down environment, be able to capture this sense of space and air around us, even if it was happening when you were within the confines of like a really small four-walled room. Because I think, especially by that point, it was like June when it first got performed, and I think everyone was just feeling like really claustrophobic by then. So it's nice to be able to, even if it's artificially, to create the sense of space.
How has life been for you since last June when this piece was first performed? How is being well, you know, individually and you know, being a person, but also being a composer and a collaborative artist been since the summer?
So, I mean, here in Scotland, life really hasn't changed a lot since then. Unfortunately, we had about 2 months of relative freedom in August, September. And then we've been pretty much back in total lockdown since October. So it's been a long time now. I mean, I barely, I'm like a hermit. I'm in my flat and we're allowed to meet one other person outside for a walk once a day. And that's all we're allowed to do. So it's been really challenging. Like I'm lucky that I already sort of had a lot of established projects, so I've had kind of creative partners to be able to still do creative projects with. But I think it would be very difficult if you were trying to do any networking or trying to work with new partners for the first time. That would definitely be hard. Yeah.
What's the first thing you want to do once you know, knock on wood, once lockdown is lifted for good?
After I just finished hugging my friends for like hours, what I really want to, like, my background is definitely in folk music as well as contemporary, and I cannot wait to get to a jam session again and just make music with people and have laughs and have some drinks and yeah, just spend the whole night making music. That's definitely the goal.
Sounds fantastic. Thank you, Ailie. I appreciate your time
Pleasure.
and
Thank
this
you so
wonderful
much.
piece.
Thank you. Thanks so much for performing it.